That day, Lena had no idea that in a matter of minutes, her life would take a turn from which there would be no return. The car ride seemed routine, just another one of those in which Kyle, her husband, maintained absolute control of the wheel while her brothers filled the air with peals of laughter. They were always pranks that bordered on cruelty, and although for years Lena wanted to believe they were simple games, deep down, she knew the intention was to humiliate her. When they stopped at a gas station in the middle of a nearly empty highway, she thought it would be a quick stop. She had no idea that that place would become the scene where everything would fall apart. Kyle asked her to go into the station shop and buy some bottles of water. It was a matter of seconds, barely enough time to walk through the door, and when she stepped back outside, the car was gone. At first, she thought it was one of those bad jokes, that they'd parked it behind her or on another corner just to watch her run away in confusion. But minutes passed, then almost an hour, and the silence of the road began to weigh on her chest. She had no cell phone, no money, no resources. There, under the relentless sun that heated the asphalt, she realized that she had been deliberately left behind, and that this supposed joke was only the most obvious form of cruelty that had been building up for years. The initial fear soon transformed into a mixture of rage and clarity. Lena sat on the curb, her throat dry and her eyes burning, and understood that there was no one coming to rescue her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't think about calling Kyle or waiting for his brothers to return with fake smiles. She thought about herself, about how much she had endured and the absurdity of still expecting even the slightest gesture of care from those who never received it. That deserted gas station became a brutal mirror of her life, surrounded by people, but always alone. She decided to walk. She had no clear direction, only the need to move and get away from that spot that symbolized her final abandonment. After almost an hour in the sun, an elderly woman driving an old sedan stopped when she saw her. She didn't ask many questions. She simply noticed her condition and offered her a ride to the nearest town. That's how Lena, still trembling, arrived at a small coastal town where she remembered her Aunt May living. That woman had been a distant link in her childhood, but now she became the only open door to starting over. When May opened the door and saw Lena in that state, there were no reproaches or unnecessary questions. She let her in, gave her water, food, and a place to sleep. For the first few days, Lena could barely articulate everything that had happened. She simply listened to the sound of the nearby sea and let the silence of the house restore some calm. Her aunt, without intruding, offered her the most valuable thing she had, a judgment-free space where she didn't need to justify her pain or her decision not to return to Kyle. That loving neutrality was the first step toward a different life. Over time, Lena found work at a small beachfront restaurant. It wasn't a job that paid much, but it gave her back something she'd forgotten, a sense of dignity. Preparing tables, serving dishes, and listening to the constant murmur of tourists reminded her that she could be useful and valued without having to beg for affection. Every tip she received was proof that she was building something of her own, and in the midst of that simple routine, she looked at herself in the mirror again without shame, understanding that she was finally moving away from the shadows that had followed her for so many years. It was at that same restaurant that she met Grant, a former detective who used to sit at the same table, staring out at the sea while he ate in silence. At first, they barely exchanged words. He seemed to carry a heavy past, and she was still wary of men. However, the consistency of his visits and the respect with which he treated her made all the difference. There were never any inappropriate innuendos or comments that made her feel small. Just simple questions, a genuine interest in how she was, and a patience that contrasted radically with Kyle's treatment. As the months passed, Lena began to trust that calm presence. Grant shared fragments of his story. He too had been betrayed. He too had experienced violence disguised as affection. That shared vulnerability brought them closer without the need for hasty promises. More than a sudden romance, what grew between them was a silent pact of respect and support. For Lena, discovering that she could speak and be heard without fear was something entirely new. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel she had to shrink back so someone else could shine. With Grant, she could be herself, unapologetically. 5 years later, Lena had built a life very different from the one she'd once believed she'd been trapped in. Her routine with Grant was simple: working at the restaurant, walking on the beach in the late afternoon, sharing quiet dinners where the conversation flowed without shouting or tension. But that peace was suddenly interrupted when a friend showed her a podcast that had gone viral. In it, Kyle's brothers proudly recounted the prank about being abandoned at the gas station as if it were a funny anecdote. Listening to their recorded laughter brought back a chill she thought she'd left behind. It wasn't long before Kyle reappeared in her life, repentant, delivering the rhetoric of a man who had supposedly changed. He claimed to seek reconciliation, talked about second chances, and tried to downplay what had happened, as if everything could be forgotten with a belated apology. But Lena was no longer the insecure, submissive woman he'd left behind on an empty road. Now she had a voice, dignity, and someone at her side who supported her. Listening to him without breaking down was confirmation that she had finally broken the cycle of humiliation. Their reunion wasn't a place for reconciliation, but rather a place where Lena could look him in the eye and make it clear that she no longer belonged to him. There was no hatred in her voice, but rather a firmness Kyle had never known in her. It was the voice of someone who had survived abandonment, ridicule, and contempt, and who had decided not to carry those chains again. Facing him, Lena understood that her true victory wasn't revenge, but proving that she had found a better path without needing him. The situation took an unexpected turn when the same brothers who had once left her alone began facing legal problems. Their boundless humor had had new consequences. In another of their supposed pranks, they almost caused the death of a young man. The case went to court, and to Lena's surprise, she was called as a witness. It wasn't just about her story. It was about exposing a pattern of cruelty that had remained disguised as laughter for too long. Agreeing to testify meant reopening wounds, but it was also an opportunity to transform her pain into denunciation. On the day of the trial, Lena arrived with Grant. The courtroom was packed, and although she knew all eyes could be on her, she wasn't intimidated. She remembered the warmth of that gas station, the solitude, the sound of the engine fading away, and for a moment she felt her throat close. But she also remembered the years afterward, her Aunt May's silent embrace, the work at the restaurant, the walks by the sea, Grant's constant presence. That memory was enough to keep her standing tall before the judges. When asked to recount what had happened, she didn't embellish or soften anything. She recounted every detail with the clarity of someone with nothing left to lose. How they left her without money, without her phone, how time seemed endless in the middle of that deserted road. When she finished, the silence in the room was louder than any murmur. Lena was no longer the helpless victim, but a woman who spoke firmly about what it meant to be humiliated and, despite everything, to rebuild herself. Her testimony became a kind of mirror for others present, a reminder that cruelty cannot be justified under the guise of a joke. The verdict against Kyle's siblings came weeks later, and while the sentence didn't erase the past, it sent a clear message. Actions have consequences, even when disguised as jokes. For Lena, the most important thing wasn't seeing them punished, but feeling that her voice had had real weight in that decision. She was no longer invisible, no longer the woman they could abandon without anyone noticing. She had spoken, and that word had brought justice not only for her, but also for those who could have been their next victims. After the hearing, Lena left the courtroom with her head held high. Outside, the cold air hit her face, but it felt like a relief. Grant took her hand without saying anything, and that gesture was enough to remind her how much her life had changed. 5 years ago, she had found herself alone on a deserted road, believing she was worthless. Now she was here, certain that she had survived, that she had built a new path, and that she no longer had to justify her existence. Her story was no longer that of an abandoned woman, but that of someone who had transformed her pain into strength. In the days that followed, Lena returned to her routine at the seaside restaurant. The regulars greeted her casually, unaware that she had testified in a case that had been reported on the local news. She preferred it that way, to be recognized for her work and not for the suffering that once defined her. As she bussed tables or served dishes, she thought about how every small gesture of normalcy had become her greatest victory. Peace lay not in the great achievements, but in those quiet days that once seemed impossible. It was during one of those sunsets, as she closed the restaurant and watched the waves gently crash against the shore, that she allowed herself a moment of reflection. If someone had told her at that gas station that 5 years later she would be standing, working, surrounded by people who valued her and beside a man who respected her, she would have thought it a white lie. And yet there she was, proving that her life wasn't destined for abandonment or humiliation. She was living proof that, even when others try to bring you down, there's always the possibility of getting back up. Over time, the memory of Kyle and her brothers stopped hurting as intensely. They were no longer ghosts haunting her dreams, but past episodes that had been etched in her memory, like warnings. When someone in town commented on the news of the trial or casually mentioned that podcast, Lena managed to listen without feeling like she was falling apart. She had achieved an emotional distance she never thought possible, and it filled her with a silent pride. Grant, for his part, became her partner beyond the romantic. Together, they began organizing small community events in the town, supporting women experiencing abuse or humiliation. They didn't do it grandly or with prepared speeches, but rather by sharing experiences, listening, and offering companionship. For Lena, each conversation with another woman who saw herself reflected in her story was like closing a circle, demonstrating that what had nearly destroyed her one day could be transformed into help for someone else. One afternoon, while speaking to a small group at the community center, Lena openly shared the details of how she had been abandoned at that gas station. The silence that followed her story was profound, and several women lowered their gaze, recognizing in her experience parts of their own. It was at that moment that she realized that her testimony wasn't just a personal outlet, but a tool to open other people's eyes. If she had previously felt ashamed to share it, now she recounted it with the certainty that doing so could save someone from repeating the same path. And perhaps this is also a good time to say it. If you've read this far, please tell us where you're reading from. Sometimes sharing where in the world we're reading these stories reminds us that no one is truly alone. The impact of her words didn't end at those community meetings. Little by little, they began inviting her to speak at schools and local associations. Lena never imagined herself speaking in front of groups, but she discovered she could do so without having to affect her voice or feign confidence she didn't feel. It was enough to tell the truth, look straight ahead, and let each person understand the message behind her experience, that it wasn't about enduring humiliation, but about recognizing when it was time to stop. Grant often sat silently with her in the audience, and that simple presence gave her strength. He wasn't a savior, nor someone who spoke in her place, but a companion who supported her without trying to control her path. For Lena, that difference changed everything. He showed her every day that it was possible to have a relationship without yelling, without contempt or mockery disguised as jokes. When she came home after each talk, she felt the wound of that abandonment heal a little more, turning it into something that no longer defined her present. As the months passed, Lena began to write short notes in a notebook. They weren't personal diaries, but rather recollections of her experiences, reflections on what she had learned, and phrases she would like others to hear if they ever went through something similar. That notebook became a personal refuge and later a project, compiling those notes to publish them as an accessible, simple, unadorned testimony. She wasn't seeking fame or recognition, only to leave a mark that would serve as a guide. One day, a young woman who worked with her at the restaurant confessed that she was trapped in a relationship of constant contempt. She told her that listening to her speak and seeing her stand firm made her realize she deserved more. Lena embraced her without needing to give a speech, understanding that this was the true dimension of her new life, being a mirror of resilience and proof that escaping a cycle of humiliation was possible. It was at that moment that she fully accepted that her story, so painful at first, had become a seed of hope for others. As the 6th anniversary of that day at the gas station approached, Lena decided to do something symbolic. With Grant and her Aunt May, she drove to a spot near the highway where it all happened. The landscape was still the same, an old station, a long road, and the same heavy silence. But this time, she wasn't alone or scared. She stopped in front of the site, took a deep breath, and left a note, writing, "Here a broken life ended, here a life full of dignity began." She didn't cry. What she felt was a calm that confirmed that the chains were no longer there. Back in town, they shared a simple meal. May, with her usual tenderness, reminded her how proud she was to see her like this, strong and renewed. Grant, for his part, barely smiled at her, as if he knew words weren't necessary to acknowledge what she had achieved. Lena understood that this trip hadn't been a way to relive the pain, but rather to demonstrate that he no longer had power over her. That road, which had once represented abandonment and humiliation, was now just a place on the map with no ability to define its value. Over time, that symbolic gesture became an even bigger turning point. Lena stopped seeing her story as an open wound and began to tell it as a victory. Every time someone mentioned what had happened, it was no longer with shame or pain, but with the serenity of someone who knows they've come through. At the restaurant, some tourists who had heard about the trial were surprised to recognize her, but she remained calm, explaining without drama that the important thing wasn't what had been done to her, but what she had built afterward. Over the years, that notebook Lena began writing almost in secret became an inseparable companion. Within its pages, she had jotted down loose thoughts, memories that still shook her, and phrases she would have liked to hear in her darkest moments. One day, a friend from the restaurant flipped through it and suggested she show it to a local publisher that published life stories. Lena hesitated for a long time. She thought no one would want to read the story of a woman abandoned at a gas station. However, when she finally plucked up the courage and handed in those crumpled pages, she received an unexpected response. The publisher told her that the most valuable aspect of it was precisely the sincerity with which it was written, without embellishment or artifice. Thus was born a small book that, although it didn't reach the major bookstores, began to circulate in the community and beyond, transforming an intimate pain into an accessible testimony. What came next surprised even Lena. She began receiving letters and messages from people who had read her story and recognized themselves in it. Women who had endured years of contempt, men carrying hidden emotional scars, young people who felt trapped in harmful relationships, all thanked her for putting into words what they dared not say. Each letter was a reminder of how far she had come, and she often read them silently with Grant, who encouraged her to keep those words as life trophies. At the restaurant, some customers timidly approached her to tell her that they had read it and that it had given them the strength to make important decisions. Lena understood then that it was no longer just about her story, but about a multiplier effect. What had once nearly destroyed her had become a tool of hope for others. The publication of the book also changed the way Lena was viewed in her own community. Before, many knew her only as May's niece or as the woman who waited tables at the beachfront restaurant. But now they regarded her with a different kind of respect, not because of fame or prestige, but because they knew she had faced brutal humiliation and emerged stronger. She was sometimes invited to schools to speak to teenagers about dignity and healthy relationships. And although she felt nervous at first, she ended up speaking naturally. She didn't need elaborate speeches. Simply sharing what she had experienced was enough for the children to understand the gravity of disguising cruelty as a joke. Each invitation was a reminder that her voice had value, something Kyle and his siblings had always denied her. At home, life with Grant remained simple, without great luxuries but full of stability. They shared quiet breakfasts, long walks on the beach, and afternoons where he read while she wrote new notes. Sometimes they talked about their past, but never with pain, rather like someone reviewing a closed file. Grant, with his serene gaze, constantly reminded her that her strength had been choosing not to remain trapped in that abandonment. For Lena, those everyday moments were the clearest proof of what it meant to rebuild. It wasn't about forgetting, but about having learned to live without fear. And every time she thought about the path they had taken, she realized that she no longer carried shame, but rather a silent pride that accompanied her everywhere. As the 7th anniversary of that gas station abandonment approached, Lena decided to write a special message on social media accompanied by a photo overlooking the sea. Her intention wasn't to generate pity or drama, but rather to show that it was possible to get back on your feet, even after hitting rock bottom. The text spoke of dignity, of choosing peace over dependence, and of the importance of not normalizing humiliation disguised as a joke. The reactions were immediate, with many sharing the post as an inspiration. And if this story touched you in any way, leave a like, comment on where you're reading it from, and share it. You never know who might find it relevant at just the right moment. That same day, after posting the message, Lena went for a walk along the shore with Grant. The wind was fresh, and the sound of the waves brought back memories of all the times she thought she couldn't bear the weight of abandonment. But looking at herself now, she realized she hadn't just survived. She had built a present she could be proud of. She remembered the faces of those who had listened to her talks, the letters kept in a wooden box, the silent hugs she had received from women who saw her as an example. All of that was stronger than any painful memory. That walk was no different from so many others, but deep down, she felt it symbolized the definitive closing of a chapter that no longer defined her life. Upon returning home, Lena sat in front of the notebook she still held and wrote one last sentence. "I am not the woman they left behind on an empty road. I am the woman who chose not to stay there." She calmly closed the notebook, aware that this truth was now an inseparable part of her. She didn't need revenge or massive recognition, because the most important thing she had already achieved, regaining her voice, her dignity, and the certainty that she deserved respect. The gas station remained in the past as a painful starting point, but also as the place where her freedom began. And as she looked at Grant and May, she knew she would never again be defined by those who tried to diminish her, because her life was now written in the ink of overcoming.